What would you do if someone tried to humiliate you in front of 60 people? What if the attack came wrapped in a question designed to make you look like a relic of the past? What if every camera in the room was pointed at your face waiting for you to crack? Most people would get defensive. Some would lash out. A rare few would simply walk away. But there is another option. One that requires something most people never develop. The ability to remain completely still while chaos swirls around you. The ability to let silence do the work that shouting never could. This is the story of what happened when a young man tried to take down a legend, and discovered that some battles are lost the moment you decide to fight them. The Beverly Wilshire Hotel has seen its share of Hollywood history. Its marble floors have been walked by stars whose names became synonymous with the golden age of cinema. Its ballrooms have hosted celebrations and announcements that shaped the entertainment industry for generations. But on this particular spring day in 1992, the elegant conference room on the third floor was about to witness something different. Something that would be discussed in newsrooms and journalism classrooms for decades to come. The room was arranged in the standard fashion for a major studio press event. Rows of chairs faced a long table covered in microphones. Camera operators had staked out their positions along the walls. Publicists clutched schedules and press kits while trying to project an air of calm control. The occasion was the press junket for a Western film that many in the industry had already dismissed before seeing a single frame. Clint Eastwood walked into that room carrying the weight of 40 years in the movie business. His face bore the lines of someone who had spent decades squinting into desert suns and facing down villains both on screen and off. At 61 years old, he occupied a strange position in Hollywood, too established to ignore. Too associated with a particular era to be considered cutting edge. The critics had been sharpening their knives for years. They called his films throwbacks. They wondered aloud in print whether he had anything left to say. They questioned whether audiences still wanted the kind of stories he specialized in telling. The Western genre itself had fallen out of favor. Young moviegoers wanted something faster. Something louder. Something that reflected the anxieties of a new decade rather than the myths of a century past. He took his seat at the center of the table with the practiced ease of someone who had done this thousands of times. The producer sat to his left. His publicist occupied the chair to his right. Bottles of water had been arranged at precise intervals. Name cards identified each person at the table, though everyone in the room already knew who they were looking at. The man with the pale blue eyes needed no introduction. His presence alone commanded a certain kind of attention. Not the frantic energy that surrounded younger stars. Something quieter. More substantial. The kind of presence that comes from having nothing left to prove to anyone. The questions began in the predictable fashion. Journalists asked about the production schedule. They inquired about working with the cast. They wanted to know how this film compared to others in his long career. He answered each query with the economy of words that had become his trademark. No elaborate explanations. No self-promotional tangents. Just direct responses delivered in that distinctive raspy voice. 40 minutes passed in this manner. The publicists began to relax. The event was proceeding exactly as planned. In another 20 minutes, they could wrap things up and move on to the next appointment. The young man in the third row had been waiting for his moment. Michael Bradford had arrived at the hotel that morning with a specific goal in mind. He wanted to make a name for himself. He wanted to write something that would be talked about. Something that would separate him from the dozens of other entertainment journalists competing for the same assignments. His magazine had built its reputation on a certain kind of fearlessness. They prided themselves on asking the questions that other outlets were too timid or too compromised to ask. At 28 years old, Michael believed he understood something that the older journalists in the room did not. He believed that the rules had changed, that access journalism was dying, that the future belonged to those willing to challenge power rather than simply transcribe its statements. He had prepared his question carefully. He had workshopped the wording with colleagues who shared his philosophy. They had assured him it would generate headlines. They had predicted that the response would be defensive and that defensiveness would become the story. Famous actor cannot handle tough question. Aging star lashes out at young journalist. These were the headlines he was already composing in his mind. He raised his hand with the confidence of someone who had already decided how this encounter would end. The publicist scanned the room and pointed in his direction. Michael stood slowly. He wanted everyone to see him. He wanted them to remember this moment. He held his recorder at chest height. A deliberate gesture designed to signal that he was capturing everything. His voice carried clearly through the space. Each word had been rehearsed. The question itself was structured as an observation with an implied challenge attached. He referenced the subject matter of the film: an aging gunfighter taking on one last job. He suggested that the parallel to the director's own career was obvious. Then came the sharp edge. The part designed to wound. He questioned whether someone of that age should step aside. He suggested that the stories being told were tired and irrelevant. He used words like modern and relevant as weapons, implying that the man seated before him was neither. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. It was not the ordinary pause that occurs when someone formulates an answer. This was something else entirely. A collective holding of breath. Journalists who had covered countless press events recognized that something unusual was happening. Several of them turned in their seats to look at the young man who had just spoken. Their expressions carried a mixture of disbelief and anticipation. The publicist's professional smile disappeared. Her hand moved toward the microphone, as if she might intervene, then stopped, because the man at the center of the table had not moved at all. Those pale blue eyes fixed on the young journalist with an intensity that seemed to pin him in place. There was no anger in that gaze, no surprise, no indication that the question had caused any emotional reaction whatsoever. Just a steady, unwavering attention that stretched 1 second into 5, then 10, then 15. The room remained absolutely still. Camera operators kept their equipment running but made no sound. Note-taking stopped. The only movement came from the young man himself. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His confident posture began to wilt under that unrelenting stare. He had prepared for many possible responses. He had not prepared for this, for silence, for patience, for the complete absence of the reaction he needed. When the response finally came, it was delivered in a voice barely above conversational volume. No increase in intensity. No dramatic inflection. Just a simple observation stated as plain fact. The words were few, 18 by most counts. They suggested that questions designed to showcase the cleverness of the questioner rarely succeed in that aim. That the need to explain why something is intelligent usually indicates that it is not. The sentence hung in the air for a moment. Then the room released its held breath in a collective exhalation that was almost physical. The exchange was not over. A brief pause followed those initial words. Then a longer observation about experience in time. About decades spent learning the craft of filmmaking. About working with people whose names now appeared in textbooks. About a particular insight gained over those years. The insight concerned the relationship between talking about relevance and worrying about one's own. The implication was clear without being cruel. The young man asking about obsolescence was revealing his own anxieties, not exposing anyone else's weaknesses. The journalist sat down quickly. His face had changed color. The flush spreading across his features told everyone in the room what his words would not admit. He fumbled with his recording device. His eyes stayed fixed on his notepad. Around him, his colleagues demonstrated the particular courtesy of not looking directly at someone who has just experienced public embarrassment. They studied their own materials. They checked their phones. They gave him the privacy to collect himself while making clear that they had witnessed everything. The remainder of the press conference proceeded without incident. The questions that followed were notably different in tone, more thoughtful, more respectful of both the subject matter and the person being questioned. The publicist had been prepared to end things early. Instead, the event continued for its scheduled duration. Something had shifted in the room, a recalibration of behavior. A reminder that certain boundaries exist for reasons that go beyond mere politeness. The young journalist left the hotel that afternoon believing he could still salvage something from the encounter. He had his recording. He had the exact words that had been spoken. He could frame the story in a way that served his original purpose. He could position himself as the brave truth-teller facing down an institution that refused to acknowledge its own decline. He returned to his hotel room and opened his laptop. He began typing the article that would establish his reputation. The one that would make editors notice his name. The one that would separate him from the pack of entertainment writers struggling for attention. But the words would not come together properly. Every angle he attempted felt false. Every attempt to spin the exchange in his favor required ignoring what had actually happened. The problem was not the question itself. Plenty of journalists had asked challenging questions of famous people. The problem was everything that surrounded it. The tone, the intent. The obvious desire to create conflict rather than illuminate anything meaningful. He tried framing the response as defensive. But it had not been defensive. He tried suggesting anger. But there had been no anger. The calm, measured nature of what he had received made his own behavior look exactly like what it was. A performance designed for his benefit rather than his readers. He filed the piece anyway. 3 days later, it appeared with a headline suggesting an aging filmmaker was clinging to outdated formulas. The article attempted to place the exchange within a larger context of Hollywood's resistance to change. It quoted the response but buried it within paragraphs of interpretation designed to minimize its impact. He read his own words on the screen and felt something he had not expected. Doubt. The nagging sense that he had made a mistake. That the article revealed more about him than about its subject. The reaction began within hours of publication. Not the reaction he had anticipated. Social media platforms that barely existed transformed the exchange into something viral. Entertainment websites picked up the story. But the headlines they wrote were not the headlines he had written in his imagination. They focused on his question. On the response it received. On the gap between what he had attempted and what he had achieved. The phrase that had been spoken in that conference room began appearing everywhere. On message boards. In comment sections. In other articles written by journalists who had been present and who offered their own observations about what had occurred. His colleagues in that room wrote their own accounts. They discussed professionalism. They examined the difference between accountability and disrespect. They used his behavior as an example of what happens when ambition overwhelms judgment. His name became attached to a cautionary tale. The young reporter who tried to embarrass a legend and embarrassed only himself. The journalist who confused provocation with courage. The writer who made himself the story instead of reporting one. The phone call from his editor came 2 days after publication. The conversation was brief and its content was devastating. Complaints had arrived from multiple directions. Publicists who controlled access to major stars. Other journalists who felt the incident reflected poorly on their profession. Readers who recognized the difference between tough questioning and personal attack. Several major studios had contacted the magazine directly. They expressed concern about future coverage. They questioned whether someone capable of such behavior should represent the publication at industry events. The editor's assessment was blunt. The article had made the magazine look amateur. It had positioned a competitor as the reasonable party in a dispute. It had surrendered the moral high ground that journalism depends upon. The reassignment came first. He was removed from entertainment coverage entirely, placed on less visible beats. Given assignments that kept him far from press conferences and industry events. 3 weeks later, the termination followed. The stated reason was corporate restructuring, budget constraints requiring difficult decisions. But the timing made the actual cause obvious to everyone familiar with the situation. He had become a liability. His name had become associated with a moment of professional failure so public that it overshadowed everything else he had accomplished. Freelance work proved difficult to find. The industry he had hoped to cover operated on relationships and reputation. Publicists remembered names. They kept lists of journalists who could be trusted and journalists who could not. Editors at other publications had seen the coverage of the incident. They had read the commentary from their peers. They had watched the video that continued circulating online. When his pitches arrived in their inboxes, they were met with polite rejections or simple silence. The doors that had seemed ready to open were now firmly closed. The passage of time did not bring the relief he expected. 6 months after that press conference, the film he had dismissed was released to audiences and critics. The response was overwhelming. Not the rejection of outdated formulas he had predicted. The opposite. Critics who had been skeptical reversed their positions. Awards began accumulating. The Academy recognized it with nominations in major categories. When the ceremony arrived, the film claimed 4 statues: Best Picture, Best Director. 2 others that confirmed what the reviews had already established. The work stood as a complete refutation of everything the young journalist had implied. Relevance had nothing to do with age. Quality had nothing to do with following trends. The man who had been dismissed as a relic had created something that would endure long after the dismissals were forgotten. The journalist watched those ceremonies from whatever distance he had retreated to. His career in entertainment writing was over. The transition to corporate communications happened gradually. A series of positions that paid adequately and demanded little beyond competence. Work that existed far from the spotlight he had once pursued. Work that allowed him to become invisible. Which was perhaps what he wanted most. To stop being associated with that single moment. To stop having his name bring up that video. To stop being the example that journalism professors used when explaining what not to do. But the internet has a particular relationship with memory. It does not forget and it does not forgive. Searches for his name continued returning the same results years later. Decades later. The video of the exchange accumulated millions of views. Comment sections filled with analysis of every second, the calm demeanor, the measured response. The visible discomfort, the shift in energy that everyone present could feel. People who had not been born when the press conference occurred discovered it and added their own observations. Each generation found the clip and learned its lessons fresh. The contrast between the two men at the center of that exchange continued to grow more stark with time. One went on making films for another 30 years, directing, acting, winning additional awards. Proving repeatedly that craft and talent do not expire according to any calendar. The other disappeared from public view almost entirely, became a footnote. A name attached to a single infamous moment. A demonstration of how quickly a career can collapse when judgment fails at precisely the wrong time. Educational institutions incorporated the incident into their curricula. Not as history. As instruction. Professors who taught media ethics and interview technique used the video to illustrate principles that textbooks struggled to convey. They asked students to identify what went wrong, to analyze the intent behind the question, to examine why the response was so effective. They pointed out that no profanity had been used, no insults exchanged, no voices raised. The entire lesson had been delivered with less than 20 words and a refusal to engage on terms that someone else had chosen. Students watched the footage and took notes. They observed how stillness can be more powerful than motion. How silence can communicate more than speech. How refusing to react to provocation denies the provocateur the response they need. These were lessons that extended far beyond journalism. They applied to any situation where someone attempts to diminish another person for their own benefit. The response modeled something that most people never learn. That dignity maintained in the face of disrespect is its own form of victory. That the person who remains calm controls the narrative. That 18 words can accomplish what 18,000 could not. The journalists who had been present that day continued talking about it throughout their careers. They described the atmosphere in that room. The tension that built during those seconds of silence. The almost physical sensation when the response was delivered. One veteran reporter offered an assessment that others quoted for years afterward. He had covered the entertainment industry for 4 decades. He had witnessed temper tantrums and dramatic exits. He had seen defensive rambling and hostile confrontation. What he had never seen was someone dismantle a challenge so completely with so little apparent effort. The response had not been destruction. It had been something closer to instruction. An opportunity to learn something offered to someone who chose not to accept it. The effect on other journalists was measurable though not quantifiable. Some took the incident as a warning about the consequences of prioritizing attention over substance. Others absorbed it as a lesson in how professionalism protects not just individual reputation, but the credibility of the entire profession. The best among them recognized something more subtle. That holding powerful people accountable does not require disrespect. That courage and provocation are not synonyms. That the most revealing questions come from genuine curiosity rather than predetermined conclusions. For the man who delivered that response, it was probably just another day in a life filled with similar days. Press conferences had been part of his existence for decades. He had faced hostile questions before. He would face them again. The particular encounter that became famous was distinguished not by anything he did differently, but by how completely it captured something he had always demonstrated. The quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are. The refusal to let others define him through their expectations or their hostility. The understanding that reactions given in anger serve the person provoking that anger, not the person feeling it. The phrase itself entered a kind of informal canon. It appeared in articles about communication and composure. It showed up on items purchased by journalism students who wanted a reminder of principles worth following. It became shorthand for an idea that applies far beyond any single profession. Substance matters more than style. The attempt to appear clever often reveals the opposite. Respect for others reflects respect for oneself. These were not new insights. They had been expressed in countless ways throughout human history. But this particular formulation attached itself to a particular moment. And that moment continued resonating long after everyone present had moved on to other concerns. The video remains accessible today. The search algorithms that determine what people find still surface it when certain names are entered. The comments continue accumulating. New viewers discover it and share their responses. The analysis never quite ends because the lesson never quite becomes unnecessary. Each generation produces its own versions of the young man who stood up in that conference room. People who believe that success comes from tearing others down. Who confuse attention with achievement. Who mistake cruelty for courage. They encounter the record of what happened when someone tried that approach with the wrong target. Some of them learn from it. Others do not. The lesson remains available regardless. The morning of that press conference was unremarkable in most ways. The hotel staff set up the room according to specifications they had followed hundreds of times. The journalists arrived with their equipment and their questions. The publicists managed the schedule and worried about the minor details that their jobs required them to worry about. No one present understood that they were about to witness something that would still be discussed 30 years later. That the interaction between a famous director and an ambitious reporter would become a permanent part of both their legacies. That 18 words would outlast thousands of articles and dozens of films. What transforms an ordinary moment into something more? The answer is rarely drama or spectacle. More often it is clarity. A moment when something true becomes visible in a way that cannot be ignored or forgotten. The truth revealed in that conference room was simple. Character matters. How someone responds under pressure reveals who they actually are. The person who maintains composure when attacked demonstrates strength. The person who attacks reveals their own weakness. These insights were not invented that day. They were simply displayed with unusual precision. The young man who asked that question had his own reasons, his own pressures, his own ambitions that seemed reasonable to him at the time. He was not a villain. He was someone who made a choice that carried consequences he had not anticipated. Someone who learned too late that the shortcuts he imagined would accelerate his career actually ended it. His story is not meant to inspire satisfaction at his downfall. It is meant to illustrate how quickly fortunes can reverse when judgment fails. How a single decision made in a single moment can define a life. How the desire to appear important can destroy the opportunity to become so. The lesson from that April day in 1992 is available to anyone willing to receive it. It concerns character. How you respond when someone treats you with disrespect says more about you than the disrespect itself. True confidence does not diminish others. It does not need to. The need to tear someone down reveals insecurity, not strength. These principles apply in conference rooms and classrooms, in workplaces and relationships, in any situation where one person attempts to elevate themselves by lowering someone else. 18 words demonstrated these truths. A career was built on them. Another career ended because of them. Millions of people watched and continue watching. The exchange between a legend and a journalist who wanted to become one remains preserved. A reminder of what happens when quiet dignity encounters calculated provocation. A demonstration that the most powerful responses are often the simplest ones. A lesson delivered without lectures, without anger, without anything more than a few well-chosen words and the willingness to let silence speak. If you found value in this story, please consider subscribing to this channel. The moments that reveal character are all around us. They appear in press conferences and private conversations. In confrontations witnessed by millions and exchanges seen by no one. Each one offers an opportunity to learn something about how to carry ourselves through a world that often rewards the wrong behaviors. More stories like this one are coming. Stories about composure under pressure. About dignity maintained in difficult circumstances. About the power of choosing carefully what we say and how we say it. Subscribe now so you never miss the lessons that ordinary moments can teach us about extraordinary character.